Welcome everyone to another episode of Reddit Chats presented by the Texocity Series, presented by the 210 Culture Podcast. My name is Donna and I am your host. And today we are doing the continuation of The Man in My Basement Takes One Step Closer Every Week, Part 5. And I just found out that there is a Part 6. So I'm going to go ahead and do Part 5 and 6 together, just so the last story can be something different. Because I've been really stuck on this story. But like, who wouldn't? It's a good fucking story. So this is Part 5 of The Man in My Basement Takes One Step Closer Every Week. Rule 8. You can leave the house, but never sleep anywhere else. Never make plans to move, even browsing for houses online, etc. The importance of this rule cannot be overstated. Leg in a blue cast. I hobbled across the street on crutches. 49 hours had passed since I fell down the stairs and saw the intruder in the basement. Or at least, I saw his hands. Enough was enough. I needed concrete answers and a concrete plan. At this rate, the intruder would reach my room in weeks, maybe days. I pounded on the neighbor's door and stopped. Something inside moved. Through frosted windows down the hallway, the blurry shadow of a door creaked open. Someone peered out. I waved politely, but they stepped back into the room and pulled the door shut. I raised my hand again to knock when the front door swung open. There stood P.T. Walker, dressed in blue jeans and a brown shirt, looking even more Clint Eastwood-like than before. "Brandon," he said, smiling warmly. I opened my mouth to respond, but realized I didn't even know his name, just the initials. "Paul's fine," he said, stepping back from the door and motioning me inside. "Paul?" I propped forward onto my crutches and... Wait! He reached behind the door and produced a box of disposable light blue masks. "You don't mind?" he said, putting a mask on himself and handing another to me. "Of course not," I said, and put the mask on. "Getting too old to risk it, you know," said Paul, stepping back from the door and once again motioning me inside. As I stepped inside, his eyes dropped to the blue cast around my leg. He raised an eyebrow. "Fell down the stairs," I said. "Ouch." He shut the door and I glanced around the house. The interior contradicted my expectations. Varnished oak walls with a smooth shine. His house felt like an old Wall Street corner office, like in those movies where men in suits pull whiskey out from beneath their desk. There was no upstairs, only the first floor, a couple bedrooms, and a door that led to what I assumed was a basement. A long hallway led to the back of the house, and I noticed the room which someone had peered out from. The door was still shut. The air smelled like tobacco and vanilla. Not a bad smell. At least, not me. Tobacco scent always reminded me of my dad's house back in Georgia, back when I was a kid and still somewhat happy. I kicked off my shoes and pressed my sock-covered feet against the floor. In this oddly fancy house, the carpet was out of place, green, scratchy, worn down to the plywood in some areas. "Please," said Paul, motioning towards the living room. I shuffled deeper into the house. Despite the sunny day outside, it was dark in here. All the blinds pulled shut. Everything cast in shadows save for a couple desk lights and beams of intruding sunlight. "Feel free to take a seat," said Paul, nodding towards a long, green velvet couch. I slumped down and immediately relief came over. Hobbling around on crutches was more tiring than it looked. "Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" said Paul. "I'm good, thanks." Paul winced, as though I offended him. "You sure? Water?" "No, thanks." Paul sat down on a wooden stool across from me, a stool that creaked with antique strain. Crossing his legs, he leaned sideways against the wall, studying me like a therapist studies a client. "So?" I took a deep breath and exhaled. "Last night, I saw him." Paul's face remained neutral. He shifted his weight slightly. "Saw who?" "The intruder." His eyes suddenly lit up and his lips twisted a little, like holding back laughter. I couldn't tell. "Sorry," he said, his face turning red. "Go on." Annoyed, I leaned forward in my seat. "What I saw has no reasonable, hands down, barely human." I trailed off into silence. "You take a photo?" "No." "Good. Keep it that way." "Why?" He studied me carefully before continuing. "You seen a doctor?" "No." He glanced down at the cast on my leg, then back up to me. I rolled my eyes. "Well, yes. You tell him about..." No. His face filled with strange relief, uncrossing his legs and leaning forward and rested his elbows on his knees. Do not tell anyone about this, not even Mitch. Do you understand? He said, suddenly serious. Sure. Paul leaned back, reached into the chest pocket of his shirt, and pulled out a cigarette. He pulled off his mask and tossed it back over his shoulder. He brought the cigarette up to his mouth, pinched it between his thin lips, and took out a pack of matches. A thump reverberated from somewhere deep inside the house. He froze, raised an eyebrow. Silence. He shrugged, struck the match, and another thump. Paul shook out the match and tossed it into an Alpha-Getty's tin can sat upon a yellow plastic crate to his left. Excuse me, he said, stepping up, turning around and marching deeper into the house. I watched as he rounded the corner and disappeared into the foyer hallway. Now, I was starting to wonder if coming over here was such a good idea to begin with. My initial meeting with Paul was surprising to say the least. His long, drawn-out bear safety monologue was odd, but endearing in a weird sort of way. But when Paul showed up at the diner, Mitch seemed truly disturbed, like he had seen a ghost. Either way, I just wanted answers. Hopefully, Paul would give me that. Right then, the sound of door clicked open in the foyer hallway. Then it clicked shut. The faintest hint of a smell entered my nostrils. The recurring smell of gasoline and burnt hair. So subtle, it might have been imagined. Down the hallways, muffled voices. Arguing? I tilted my head and strained to listen, but... Sorry about that, said Paul, suddenly stepping into the room. No worries. With pin-straight posture, Paul sat down on the couch across from me, a brown, velvet couch with old-time drawings of farms and ducks that reminded me of a sofa at my grandma's house, the same one I slept on after Grandpa's funeral. You want answers, huh? Said Paul, striking a match, lighting up the cigarette, and finally taking a slow, satisfied drag. The smoke lingered around him for a moment, then slowly drifted back towards the dining room. Why does Mitch think you're dead? Paul nodded, as though expecting the question. Reaching over the side of the couch, he tapped the cigarette with his pointer finger. Small bits of glowing ash broke off and tumbled down into the tin can. Back when Mitch and Rachel, his sister, were in high school, said Paul, I had some serious health issues. Still do, full disclosure, but I'm medicated now and that helps. He lifted the cigarettes to take another drag, but stopped short, remembering something. He lowered it and continued. After my father passed away, I started to believe something was stalking me, toying with me. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Started with small things at first. Bumps in the night, food gone bad before the expiry date, things too small to talk about, but too big to just, brush off. He met my eyes, then looked away and took another short drag off the cigarette. I thought back to the expired milk in my fridge, one of the many unanswered questions still festering in the back of my mind. Paul sighed. I'm a rationalist at heart, so the possibility of something unnatural, he waved his fingers like a magician, that never crossed my thoughts. He paused again, glancing over at me, judging my reactions as he spoke. Now bear with me, 'cause all this leads to a point, he continued. One night, back in 94, maybe 93, the kids and their mom were fast asleep. It was Thursday, so I went down to the basement for canned peaches and a late-night beer. He pointed down at the floor. The light wasn't working, so I came back with a flashlight and he trailed off into silence, his cold blue eyes still locked on the floor. This time, someone was down there, just standing there, stood down the basement hallway with their back turned to me. I wanted to call out, scream, run upstairs, get my 9mm, but instead, I just froze, like roadkill in headlights. Paul looked directly at me. That's when it hit me. I realized that the intruder, over 7 foot tall by the way, he was halfway stuck into the concrete wall, like the mold was set around him and dried there. Paul shook his head like a chill went down his spine. I couldn't even think straight. He leaned over and rubbed his forehead with the back of his thumb. A weird tick that suddenly stood out to me. Mitch did the same thing, and so did Howie. Things got really bad after that. The more I tried to fight it, the worse it got. Of course, nobody else saw him. They just saw a stack of cardboard boxes. He paused again, looking around the room. One night, cold, autumn night, I downed 2 Mickeys of Koval and brought my 9mm downstairs. Marched straight up to him. He made a gun with his fingers and pointed at me. pressed the barrel between his dead eyes and pulled the trigger. He mimed the motion of a gun kickback and limply dropped his hand back into his thigh. Buddy didn't even flinch. Bullet went straight through him, ricocheted off the back wall, and got me in the hand. He held up his left hand. The pinky was cut off short at the first knuckle. I hadn't even noticed this until just now. He shook his hand like it went numb and leaned back into his seat again. After that, Holly threatened to leave, take the kids with her. He rubbed the side of his palm against his left forearm, ruminating. His eyes suddenly lit up, as if remembering something. "Let me show you something," he said, pushing up from the couch. He strolled towards the door I assumed led to the basement. I remained seated. After my last encounter with the intruder, I wasn't a big fan of stairs, or basements for that matter. "You coming?" Paul, noticing my hesitation, looked back at me the same way my dad used to, struggling to hide disappointment. I cleared my throat, grabbed my crutches, and pushed to standing. Paul smiled a half smile, pulled another disposable mask out from his back pocket, and put it on. Stood in front of the basement door. He pulled a ring of keys out from his front porch. Humming to himself, he rifled through until finding the key he wanted. He unlatched the chosen key and turned the lock. No dice. He relatched the key and went back to rifling, still humming all the while. Meanwhile, I stood back about 10 feet, eyes locked on the mysterious room at the end of the hallway. The door was shut. "You live alone?" "Yes," said Paul. "Well, yes and no." He unlatched another key and gave that one a try. No dice. "An old friend lives in the room down the hall. I'm the caretaker, sort of," he said nonchalantly. "That's good for you." "Yeah, well, I owe them one," said Paul, unlatching a third key from the ring, holding it up to his face and studying it like a jeweler studies a suspect diamond. He brought it down to the lock, pushed it in, and turned. Finally, the door clicked open. "Third time's the..." Paul looked around, searching for words the same way Howie did. Shaking his head, Paul tucked away the key and stepped down into the dark. He flicked the light on, and cold, fluorescent glow stammered to life. Concrete walls and wooden steps smothered in layers of dust. Paul looked back over his shoulders. "You good with stairs?" he said, looking down at my cast-covered leg. "I'll try." He nodded. "Use the railing." He turned back and stepped deeper into the basement. I hobbled across the hallway and stood at the top of the stairs. Peering down, the flight of steps seemed longer than expected, like it went down 1.5 stories instead of just one. Paul stood at the bottom, another door in front of him, though maybe door wasn't quite the right word, more like a bunker hatch, metallic and held shut with an arm-sized lever instead of a doorknob. Paul gripped his hands around the lever, braced himself against the wall, and pulled. His wiry arms flexed and strained as the lever slowly lurched towards him. Gritting his teeth, Paul yanked harder and harder until finally the lever gave away, swung backwards suddenly. The metallic door itself shifted downward with an echoing clang, and the clouds of dust particles burst out from the edges. Paul wiped his forehead with the back of his arm, squat down, and grabbed the bottom of the door with both hands. Hoisting upward, he pushed the door into a vertical swing. It pressed flat up against the ceiling. There was nothing but darkness ahead. Paul crept forward, and silence followed. 5 long seconds ticked by until a light flicked on. More cold, stuttering glow. "You good?" Paul's voice echoed up the staircase. Yeah, I'm okay," I said. Stepped forward once again, being dragged. The magnetic pull of morbid curiosity. Going downstairs on crutches was even more tedious than expected. The whole precarious journey took about 3 minutes until finally I stepped into the basement. A long, narrow hallway led to a 2-way fork in the path. Dirt floors, plywood walls. "I've got an engineering/construction background," said Paul, strolling forward. "Built this place from the ground up." He stopped at the fork of the hallway and looked both ways, thinking. He looked left, he looked right, he looked left again. He shrugged. "Gotta be this way." He pushed forward and followed. "Basement's bigger than you'd think," he said as we rounded the corner. Another narrow hallway led about 20 feet until it reached another 2-way fork. Paul kept walking, and I kept following. "I put up these walls, tried to build a maze around him, slow him down," he chuckled, rounding another corner. "Then I put up the bunker hatch and..." He trailed off into silence, rounding yet another corner. We entered a 10-foot by 10-foot room. He stepped into the middle and turned back to face me. "This, my friend, is the construction of a former madman," he said playfully, looking around. "Holly left me halfways into me building it." He shook his head and spat at the ground. I don't blame her. He looked directly at me. Look, kid, he paused. You want all this to go away? You want to stop having these encounters? Work on yourself. I blinked. Are you kidding me? He shrugged and continued. Look, I know how it sounds, but after Holly took the kids and left, it really kicked me into gear. I stopped drinking, got help, professional help, started taking meds, the right meds, and sure enough, all this went away. No more men in the basement, no more altered reality bullshit. I know, it's the last thing you want to hear, but this thing, it's all in your mind. You don't think it's a little odd that my hallucinations match yours? Paul nodded understandingly. What do you think set all this off? I shook my head. The note, said Paul. The note my son, well-meaning though he was, left on your doorstep. I just wanted to leave now. I was tired. You ever heard of a tulpa? Said Paul, reaching forward and placing his hand onto my shoulder. I didn't respond. I just stood there, staring at him blankly, leaning forward on my crutches. Tulpas, Paul continued, are these things that don't exist until you believe they exist. The more you believe they exist, the more they exist. And the more they exist, the more they fuck with you. If I wasn't so tired, I would have laughed. Okay? Look, I'm not saying that's what this is, but it might be what this is. Sure, Mitch, bless him, he still thinks it's all real. Thinks it got me years back. Thinks it's controlling me now, using me to trick others into worshipping it or something. He smiled grimly. It's a different story every time. Paul shook his head. All I can say is this. It's not real, but the only way to stop it is to figure out what's wrong with your life and fix that. Something upstairs moved. 3 quick, staggering footsteps. Paul glanced at the ceiling, then back to me. Ignore the intruders and follow the rules until you fixed your life, or until you stop believing it. Then you take that coat rack out past city limits and you douse it in gasoline and you burn it, okay? Okay, I said non-committally. Finally, he pulled his hand off my shoulder. You need help with anything, I'm always here. You got booze problems, life problems, anything, he said, his eyes filled with sincerity. This thing, it really messes with your head. It makes it hard to know who you can trust, Sometimes it feels like it's almost jumping in and out of people around you, controlling them, but it's all in your head. His tone was shifting now, almost sounding excited. Part of me wondered if the intruder was controlling him right now, deriving twisted pleasure out of messing with me. I shook off the thought, and another thump upstairs. Paul acted like he didn't hear it. I should go, I said, stepping backward. Sure, kid, said Paul, again talking to me like I was his son. I turned around as fast as I could without tripping. I crouched my way out of the basement maze, up the stairs, and out the front door. I stepped out of Paul's house and took a deep breath of fresh air. It felt like getting rescued from a drowning river. I exhaled relief. At this point, I didn't trust Paul or Mitch, or even fucking Howie for that matter. Nothing was stable. And everything was getting worse. I hobbled back across the street and my phone buzzed to life in my front pocket. I stopped in the middle of the road, pulled out the phone, and flicked on the screen. Squinting, I held it up to my face. 27 missed calls from Mitch Walker, of course. Damn! So he had the conversation with the dad, and the dad was like, nah, man, this shit is all in your head. Brandon's like, oh, I don't fucking think so if we got the same shit, homie. And he's like, nah, it's all in your head, trust me. I think it really is in him, and the intruder is messing with Brandon because, this is just too coincidental that they're going through the same shit. Is it or is it not? Seriously. But we're going to go ahead and jump into part 6 now. Rule 7. The intruder will not move as long as you have guests in the house. Guests who actually want to be there. Coat rack. Where are you? Said Mitch. Sounded like he hadn't slept in days. Home? I said, rifling through a box of tools. My phone, set to speaker, sat on the garage floor. You didn't see my calls? Yeah, my bad. Service out here. Look, Brandon, he cleared his throat. I need you to be 100% honest. Did you speak with the neighbor? Yes. A long, draining silence followed, and then, click, Mitch ended the call. Shaking my head, I went back to searching for tools. Right now, I didn't have the time to worry about Mitch. First, I needed to barricade the basement door. Second, I needed to call every single person in my contact list and offer them the spare bedroom, rent-free. Digging through the tangled mess of tools, my hand finally gripped around a familiar, smooth, wooden handle. Out from the box, I pulled the hammer. Bingo! Resting on a single crutch, I stood at the basement door, pounding nail after nail into scraps of 2x4s and whatever else I could find. Unlike Paul, I didn't have the resources or the knowledge to build an apocalyptic bunker door. This makeshift zombie defense would have to do for now. Hammering away faster and faster, I once again fell into a strange calm, a meditative peace that filled every breath with purpose, and my hand slipped. The hammer slammed into my pointer finger and throbbing pain shot up my arm. Cursing through my teeth, I clenched my hand tight. The hammer fell to the floor and dented headfirst into the hard wood. Fucking idiot, stupid, fucking idiot. My thoughts exploded into a tirade of self-abusive screaming. A few seconds went by and the pain numbed. My thoughts cleared. I took in 3 slow breaths and squat down to pick up the hammer. I froze. Through the bottom crack of the door, the basement light was on. I honestly couldn't remember if I turned it off or not, but the light being on didn't bother me. Not anymore. Not after everything I've seen. What bothered me was a dark shadow stood on the other side of the door, flanked by orange glow. That and the sound of breathing, barely audible but unmistakable, labored, strained, and rattling like an empty bottle of spray paint. Suddenly, the door pushed forward slightly, as if hands pressed against the other side. Breathing deep, I gripped my hand around the hammer and rose to standing. Leaning forward, I turned my head and pressed my ear flat against the door, listening. The intruder was whispering, "Fucking idiot." He grasped, quick and stuttering, "Stupid fucking idiot." Labored breathing continued all for a while, almost as if it were 2 separate voices. He was repeating my earlier thoughts out loud, right down to every random intrusion. Dent in the floor, dent in the floor. Lights on? Turn them off? The whispering continued. Is that breathing? I think, breathing? House? Coat rack? Basement? Dent in the floor? Dent? I'd heard enough. I stepped back, shook my hand out, lined up another nail, and hammered away. It's not real, I told myself. It's all inside of your head. Finally, I slammed the last nail into the last board. I took 4 steps back and marveled at the ramshackle creation. It wasn't pretty, but it got the job done. My eyes flicked involuntarily to the bottom of the door. The light was off now, and the whispering had stopped. Wiping my forehead, I turned back towards the living room and slumped down onto the couch. I took my phone and pulled open my contact list. Time to find a willing guest. 2 hours later, dialing number after number, straight to voicemail after straight to voicemail, and not a single bite. Coat rack. Only one person actually answered. A roommate from college. I'd be more than down, he said, but I'm up in Canada now, of course. I tucked my phone away, just about ready to give up when 3 small knocks at the front door. I had a pretty good idea of who it was. Pushing up from the couch, I grabbed my crutches, marched across the room, and pulled open the door. Hey, Brandon. There stood Howie, dressed in a red sweater, red jeans, and a green backpack, looking a little less chipper than usual. Hey, Howie, I said, trying my best to act normal, despite the fact a living nightmare stood mere feet away. Howie, despite all his quirks, was a sight for sore eyes. Sure, I didn't trust him, but at least he wasn't Mitch or Paul. Yeah, so this is kind of awkward, but I'm wondering if I could crash here for a couple days, he said. I can sleep on the couch, pay rent, whatever. No worries if not, he shrugged. I looked back over my shoulder, then back to Howie. Sure. Immediately, he pushed past me, strolled across the room, threw his backpack on the floor, plopped down into the living room couch, and kicked up his feet. What's with the door, he said, pointing at the barricaded basement door. Pulling the front door shut, I stepped forward. It's an art project, I lied. Replacing the door frame anyways. Huh, said Howie, clearly not buying it. Shrugging, he turned back to the TV. Where's the remote? Howie's sudden arrival was suspiciously convenient at best, and outright malicious at worst. But right now, I didn't have time to think about that. If the rules held, his being here would at least buy me some time to figure out how to stop all this. Maybe I'd sell the house. Maybe I'd defer ownership back to the bank. But judging by the no third parties rule, I doubted either of those would actually work. So far, the only people who knew about the intruder were Mitch and his father, And according to Mitch, he didn't count as third party because he'd already believed. But Paul, his father, that part was getting to me. Something was missing. Paul's whole fix your life, fix your problem spiel bothered me, but something else bothered me more, and I didn't know what it was. Like that feeling you get when you're about to leave home and you know you left something important behind, like a nagging itch in the back of your head. I offered Howie the spare room, but he preferred the couch. I didn't fight him on it. I wanted to keep him here as long as possible. I didn't even ask why he needed to stay. It was kind of nice to not be alone in the house for once. At 9:30, Howie fell asleep watching Jeopardy reruns. I muted the television and went upstairs. Tomorrow, I'd plan my next steps. But right now, I needed sleep. I climbed into bed and flicked the lights off. A bump in the night snapped me awake. A heavy thud, like somebody hit their fist against the wall. I climbed out of bed and, hopping on one leg, pulling on a dirty t-shirt and a pair of jeans, I tucked my chrome switchblade into my back pocket. Another thud from downstairs, heavier than the last. What was Howie going to say about this? I grabbed my crutches, carefully moved down the stairs, and peered into the living room. The blue glow of muted television cast over the room. Howie was still fast asleep on the couch. Thump, the basement door shook this time, like somebody slammed their forehead against it. I backstepped away, deeper into the living room. Howie was out like a rock. Heavy sleeper. Thump. Okay? I told myself to breathe. Remember the rules. Barricading the door will slow him down, but it'll be loud. That's all this was. I'll put in some earplugs and blast white noise and fall asleep. Turning back towards the kitchen, I stepped across the room as quiet as possible. Last thing I wanted was for Howie to wake up and start asking me more questions. Thump. This time the hardwood floors shook beneath my feet. I froze. My eyes drifted back to Howie, still asleep, his face motionless, almost serene. I turned back for the kitchen. I was starting to wonder if Howie could ever hear the sounds coming from the basement. Stepping into the kitchen, Brandon? A small, muffled voice called out from behind. I looked back over my shoulder, towards the basement door. Brandon? The voice repeated, slightly deeper now. I turned around and faced it head on. You in there? From behind the basement door. The voice strained, sympathetic, and familiar. You okay? Suddenly, the voice shifted into a perfect mimic of my late father, gently knocking the same way he did to my bedroom door after Zach, my best and only childhood friend, died. A memory I did my best to ignore until now. After Zach died, I biked home, sat on my bed, and stared blankly at the vinyl closet doors for 3 hours straight, eyes tracing every path of wood grain pattern again and again. The entire world outside dissolving into nothing. The stars scraped painted walls around me, somehow pushing closer and closer. I'm here if you need to talk, kid, my father called out one last time. For a second, I forgot it was the intruder speaking. For a second, I actually believed it was Dad down there, gently knocking at the basement door. Silence, lingering silence that stretched on for minutes, while I just stood there, paralyzed, not breathing, eyes locked on the basement door. Finally, my lungs forced me to grasp in air. Oxygen flooded into my brain and awareness came rushing back. I looked around the room. On the TV played a silent infomercial about some vegetable blender thing. Howie was still fast asleep. I shook out my hands, went back into the kitchen, opened the drawer beside the fridge, and pulled out a pair of orange earplugs. It's not real, I told myself again, trying to take Paul's advice. I slid the drawer shut. It's all inside of your head. But again, the words fell flat, like empty platitudes after a funeral. I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sorry for your loss. I turned back across the living room and crouched my way onto the stairs. Time to sleep. Time to sleep. Brandon? I was halfway up the stairs when a different voice called out from behind the basement door. A teenager's voice, strange yet familiar. I looked back over my shoulder. Brandon? The voice repeated, this time tinged with fear, this time completely familiar. Long forgotten memories came rushing back, memories of Zach, my childhood friend, memories I ignored and shoved away because it was easier to pretend they never happened. It was easier to do everything in my power to ignore it than to face the dread head on. It was easier to pretend Zach never even existed. Brandon, help! Zach's voice quivered, terrified. "Something's down here," he whispered. "Brandon?" He pulled at the door handle and the door shook. "Brandon?" he whimpered, the fear in his voice growing each time he spoke. "Brandon, open the door, please." He pulled at the handle again, harder this time. "Brandon, please, open the door." He banged a fist against it. "Brandon? I'm sorry, Brandon." His voice trailed off into sobbing whimpers, and he slid down the door. Muffled weeping, an image crawled into my head. The image of Zach, green hoodie pulled over his head, curled up into a ball, weeping at the top of the basement stairs. Silence. Up from the basement, echoing through a vent in the wall next to my ear, a shrill scream of terror. Primal, almost inhumane, followed by the quick thumping sound of a body dragged over stairs, screaming and pleading all the while. Drugged downstairs, down the hallway, into the rec room, kicking and screaming and begging. "I'm sorry," another voice, panicked and remorseful. "I'm sorry, Zach. Zach, I'm sorry. I can't. I don't." The sickening sound of a bone cracked against concrete, like a tree branch snapping in the wind. The percussive beat of skull against stone, again and again and again. Whimpering shrieks of help, turning more unintelligible with every impact. Even worse, the person killing him was profusely and sincerely apologizing all while. "I'm sorry. Oh God, I'm so sorry, Zach." Sudden silence. 5 seconds or 5 minutes, I don't know. Only silence, silence, and then sniffling whimpers. Not Zach's voice, not my father's voice. The voice who I assumed was the intruder, crying, almost sobbing. "Oh no," it moaned, filled with unimaginable guilt. "Oh God, I'm sorry. I'm sorry," it wailed. Then I heard it drop to its knees and fall to its side and curl up into a ball and trail off into pitiful, whimpering sorrow. This went on for several minutes until, finally, it trailed off into more silence. Sniffling, the sound of somebody standing up, the sound of somebody dragging a body against concrete, deeper and deeper into the basement, quieter and quieter, as if the rec room stretched on further than it should, further and further away until nothing. Dazed in a trance, I wandered up the stairs and into my bedroom. I pulled the door shut, stuck my earplugs in, and crawled into bed. I shut my eyes, and realization flooded over me. Coat rack. Finally, I understood the nagging itch in the back of my head. A realization so obvious, I hated myself for not getting it sooner. I burst into laughter. Not happy laughter. Not funny laughter. Insane, compulsive laughter. Curling into a ball on my bed, I turned onto my side and stared at the fake cherrywood vinyl closet doors. The doors that reminded me of my childhood bedroom. My eyes traced along the paths of wood grain patterns, and the words of Paul played through my head all the while. "You take that coat rack out past city limits, and you douse it in gasoline, and you burn it." I told Paul a lot of things, but I never told him about the coat rack. More updates on the way. Oh, motherfucker! I don't know. Y'all think this is really in his head, though? Because, I mean, the intruder was basically being loud by replaying his memories, or his traumatic memories of Zach, his childhood best friend who died. And they don't really tell you in the story how he died, but the way that the coat rack is imagining or is saying it is that beat him to death. Somebody beat him to death. That's the vibe I'm getting. That is true, though, that when he does talk to Paul, he doesn't tell him about the coat rack. He just tells him about the intruder. So how does Paul know that that's a fucking coat rack? Because Paul saw it through some cardboard boxes. But how does he know that Brandon is seeing it, the intruder, through a coat rack? Because he does tell him that. He does tell him to take the coat rack out past city limits and, drench it in gasoline and burn it. But Brandon didn't tell him that. This is my idea. Mitch is obviously mad at Brandon because Brandon went to talk to Paul, his father, because Mitch knows that the intruder is in Paul. The intruder being Paul. Paul is over here denying that the intruder, or is in him as possessing him. That's why Paul was like, well, I fixed my problems. It's all in your head. It's all in your mind. And so because he told Brandon that, I think the intruder ended up getting into Brandon's mind. And that's why when he barricades the doors, and it says, rule number 7, 8, you can barricade him to stop him from getting closer, but it's going to be loud. He thought it was just going to be like thumps and, scratches and sounds and stuff like that. But because the intruder already is messing with Brandon's mind, the intruder ends up messing with Brandon by, I'm not sure if those are the right words that I'm using, but acting out, replaying the memories of, the night that Zach, his best friend, died. His dad coming in and asking him if he's okay. And then the fact that tragedy that happened to Zach also is in his memories. Now it just makes me think if Brandon was there when this was happening to Zach, or if it's just like, oh, I'm gonna fuck with him by Zach yelling out stuff. Because like I said, it doesn't say how Zach died and Brandon didn't bring it up. But it just makes me wonder, like, was he there when he died? Or did he find him dead? Well, did he hear him? It's too many questions. And also just wonder if Mitch is even going to come back. Mitch is clearly like, do not talk to him. Because that's not him. But of course, curiosity kills a fucking cat. So that's why he got his leg all broken and fucked up. It's just so interesting, You are your own worst enemy. And I feel like this is a good example of that. Your mental stability can really fuck with you. And I know this from experience. Being just diagnosed with ADHD and depression, it's a constant battle within yourself to feel better and feel happy. And there's a lot of days where you're not going to be able to feel happy, and there's days where you are. It just really depends. The end. Period. With the little hand motion. Period. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in to the Texocity Reddit Chats presented by the 210 Culture Podcast. Thank you so much, you guys, for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, 210 Culture, and be placed on notifications so that you are notified when the latest episodes of the Texocity series comes out. And with that being said, my name is Donna, and you guys have a great day. Bye.